The story of Andrei Chikatilo, the Rostov Ripper. Everyone was afraid of him, not in the abstract way people fear distant danger, but in a quiet, constant way that changes how you live your life. Parents walked their children to school and back, even when it was inconvenient. Teenagers who once stayed out late began going home before dark. Entire neighborhoods became more cautious, more watchful, more tense. There was a feeling in the air that something was wrong, something unseen, moving between ordinary places, train stations, forest paths, empty lots. Places that should have been mundane were now charged with unease. For more than a decade, this man operated within that fear. He blended into everyday life so completely that no one could point to him and say, "That's the one." He had a job, a family, a routine. On the surface, he looked like anyone else. But behind that surface was a pattern of violence that would eventually make him one of the most notorious serial killers in history. He took more than 50 lives, and for years, he was not stopped. To understand how this happened, you have to begin long before the crimes, before the investigations, before the headlines, before the fear spread across entire regions. You have to begin with a child. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born in 1936 in a small village in Soviet Ukraine, a place shaped by hardship long before he entered the world. His early years unfolded in the shadow of one of the most devastating periods in Soviet history. The famine of the early 1930s had left deep scars on rural communities. Even years later, its memory lingered in conversations, in warnings, in stories told to children. Some of those stories were meant to explain suffering, others were meant to frighten. There were whispers of desperate acts committed in order to survive, stories of people crossing lines that should never be crossed. Whether all of them were true did not matter as much as the fact that they were heard, absorbed, and internalized. For a young child, the world was already a place where danger could come from hunger, from war, from people themselves. His family life did not offer stability. His father was captured during World War II, an event that carried heavy consequences in Soviet society. Returning prisoners of war were often viewed with suspicion, sometimes even treated as traitors. That stigma did not just affect the individual, it extended to the entire family. At home, his mother was strict and emotionally distant. Accounts describe a household where discipline was harsh and affection was limited. Mistakes were punished. Weakness was not tolerated. Andrei grew up physically frail and socially isolated. He struggled with chronic bedwetting, something that became a source of humiliation both at home and at school. Instead of receiving support, he was shamed for it. Repeatedly, children at school noticed his vulnerability. He was mocked, excluded, and bullied, and he had no real sense of safety either inside or outside the home. Over time, this combination of fear, shame, and isolation began to shape his inner world. He became withdrawn, quiet, observant. He spent more time in his own thoughts than in the company of others. And somewhere in that internal space, unusual associations began to form. Experiences of humiliation and emotional pain did not simply pass through him, they lingered. They mixed with confusion, with frustration, with impulses he did not understand. There was no one to help him process those feelings, so they remained unresolved. As he grew older, Chikatilo showed signs of intelligence and discipline in certain areas. He did well in school, particularly in subjects that required memorization and structure. Education offered him something his personal life did not, a sense of order. He eventually pursued higher education and later became a teacher. From the outside, this looked like success. He had achieved a respected position. He had integrated into society. He had done what was expected of him. He married. He had children. To neighbors and colleagues, he appeared unremarkable. But beneath that surface, there were ongoing struggles that never resolved. he had significant difficulties forming normal emotional and intimate connections. His relationships were strained, not built on genuine closeness, but on obligation and appearance. Reports suggest that he experienced severe dysfunction in his private life, which contributed to a growing sense of inadequacy. That inadequacy did not fade with time. It intensified. What began as insecurity slowly transformed into resentment, and then into something more complex and more dangerous. He developed intrusive thoughts, fantasies centered around control, domination, and violence. These were not fleeting ideas. They were persistent, returning again and again, becoming more detailed over time. At first, they remained internal. But the boundary between thought and action is not always stable. In 1978, that boundary broke. Chikatilo committed his first known murder. The victim was a young girl. He approached her in a public space, spoke to her, gained her trust just enough to lead her away from safety. What followed was chaotic and uncontrolled. This was not a carefully planned act. It was impulsive, driven by a surge of internal tension that he could no longer contain. The violence was severe, and afterward, something changed. For the first time, the internal pressure he had carried for years found a release through action. The connection between violence and psychological relief became established. That moment was critical, because once that association formed, it reinforced itself. For a period of time, there was no immediate pattern that investigators could identify. The crimes were spaced out. They did not yet form a clear series, but internally, the process was developing. Chikatilo began to refine his behavior. He learned from each act, not in a formal sense, but through experience. He became more deliberate in how he approached victims, how he selected locations, how he minimized the risk of being seen. By the early 1980s, the frequency of the crimes increased. He targeted individuals who were vulnerable, children traveling alone, women in isolated areas, people who could be approached without drawing immediate attention. He often initiated contact in places that naturally involved strangers interacting, train stations, bus stops, markets. He presented himself as harmless, polite, ordinary. That was his greatest advantage. Once he gained a small degree of trust, he would suggest moving to a quieter location, a shortcut, a walk, a conversation away from noise. And once they were isolated, the situation changed completely. The violence that followed was not only lethal, but excessive. Investigators later noted that the level of aggression went beyond what was necessary to cause death. It reflected something deeper, an attempt to exert total control, to eliminate resistance, to dominate completely. Afterward, he would leave the scene and return to his normal life. That contrast made detection extremely difficult. As the number of victims grew, so did the pressure on law enforcement. But the investigation faced serious obstacles. At the time, the concept of a serial killer was not widely acknowledged within Soviet criminal doctrine. There was a reluctance to frame the crimes as the work of a single individual operating over time. Instead, cases were often treated separately as isolated incidents. This fragmented approach delayed the recognition of a pattern. Mistakes followed. Several individuals were arrested based on circumstantial evidence or coerced confessions. In one case, a man was convicted and executed for a crime that was later linked to Chikatilo. These errors not only failed to stop the real perpetrator, they allowed him to continue. Meanwhile, fear continued to spread. Entire regions began to change their behavior. Parents warned their children about strangers. Authorities increased patrols. But the killer adapted. He shifted locations. He altered his timing. He remained unpredictable enough to avoid forming a clear, consistent pattern. A turning point came when investigators began to consider psychological profiling. One of the key figures involved in this effort was Alexander Bukhanovsky, a psychiatrist who approached the case from a behavioral perspective rather than purely forensic evidence. He analyzed the crime scenes, the victim profiles, the nature of the violence. From that, he constructed a profile of the likely offender. He suggested that the killer was not an obvious outcast, but someone who appeared functional within society, educated, possibly employed in a position that allowed mobility, socially awkward, but not isolated enough to draw suspicion. He emphasized internal conflict, a person driven by deep psychological tension, using violence as a form of release. This perspective was not universally accepted at first, but it provided a new direction. It allowed investigators to narrow their focus. In 1990, after years of uncertainty, the investigation began to converge. Chikatilo had previously come into contact with authorities, but had been released due to insufficient evidence. This time, however, he attracted attention again. He was observed in areas where victims had disappeared. His behavior raised suspicion, lingering, watching, moving in ways that did not align with ordinary routines. Surveillance was established. Investigators monitored his movements over time, building a pattern. Eventually, they made the decision to arrest him. This time the case was stronger. There was behavioral evidence. There were connections that had not been recognized before. And most importantly, there was persistence. During interrogation, something unexpected happened. Chikatilo began to confess. At first, the admissions were limited. Then they expanded. He described locations, sequences, details that had not been publicly disclosed. Information that could only come from someone directly involved. The scope of his crimes became clear. Dozens of victims, multiple regions, years of undetected activity. For investigators, it was both a breakthrough and a shock. The trial that followed was one of the most high-profile in the late Soviet and early post-Soviet period. Chikatilo was placed in a metal enclosure during court proceedings, a measure taken both for security and to protect him from the anger of the victims' families. His behavior in court was inconsistent. At times he appeared calm and composed, at other times he shouted, laughed, or behaved erratically. These fluctuations led to discussions about his mental state, but ultimately the court found him competent to stand trial. The evidence presented was extensive. Testimonies, forensic links, confessions. There was little doubt about the outcome. In 1992, Andrei Chikatilo was convicted of 52 murders. He was sentenced to death. 2 years later, in 1994, the sentence was carried out. His life ended with a single gunshot. What remains after a case like this is not just the record of crimes, but the impact they leave behind. The investigation exposed critical weaknesses in the system, gaps in coordination, limitations in forensic methods, resistance to new concepts like behavioral profiling. In response, changes were made. Criminal profiling gained recognition. Investigative methods evolved. There was greater acknowledgement that such patterns of violence could exist and needed to be addressed differently. But those institutional changes exist alongside something else, the absence of more than 50 individuals whose lives were cut short. The families who were left searching for answers, the communities that lived in fear for years. No narrative, no matter how detailed, can fully account for that loss. What it can do is document, analyze, and attempt to understand, not to justify, but to prevent repetition. Because cases like this are not only about the past, they are warnings. And whether those warnings are understood determines what happens next. Thank you for listening to this story. If you found this deep dive compelling and want more long-form narratives like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode.